So maybe I'll start with a small story, personal account. The first time we went negotiating the budget, and as you may know, that's quite a lot, and that's quite often and regularly these days. I entered the Prime Minister's office. Of course, I tried to put on my most authoritative posture so as to impress my other my other colleagues. You will not be surprised. I'm often, in fact, always the youngest person in these negotiating groups. And so I entered this room where the Sherpas are. We're called the Sherpas because we assist the ministers in handling all their dossiers. And so I enter this room. There's a butler there, stone-faced, pulls back the chair so I can sit down. I sit down, puts back the chair, I sit down, and of course my 2 meters and 100 kilos rip the canvas of this old Victorian chair. And so there I was with my authoritative posture. The whole room, of course, was laughing, and that includes the usually stone-faced butler. And so this small anecdote is actually, well, I would later learn that this anecdotic but rather spectacular entry would symbolize many more meetings to come in my short period at the federal government. Well, my enthusiasm to change things would go against the established norms until sometimes they indeed would break. So I think I may make this comparison here in this arena that the very competent people that manage Belgium's social security system and with whom I often have to negotiate can be compared to these chairs in the Prime Minister's office. They're old, they're decorative and static objects. And sometimes I would be forced to break one or two. So, as I said, today I want to talk to you about how we can challenge these traditional power structures, both from the inside, and I will tell you a couple of stories and examples from my personal experiences, and then also from the outside through 2 initiatives in which I participated actively. Voila. Oh, I forgot my slides. Yes, okay. It comes as no surprise, I guess, to many of you that we face important challenges, especially my generation, climate change, of course, a new world order, aging, public debt, especially in Belgium, etc., etc. And of course, so a couple of challenges here. These challenges, of course, will require important structural reforms. We will need to change many things in our system. And that's definitely true for my field of expertise. That's, again, social security and healthcare and public health. To name only a couple: aging, very expensive drugs and treatments coming on the market, a lot of underconsumption amongst the most vulnerable social groups, etc., etc. But the institutions that are supposed to implement some of the reforms that politicians have decided upon, well, they often think otherwise. And why is that? Well, the management boards of these institutions, think of the health and disability insurance institution, think of the social security institution, think of other institutions. Well, in Belgium, their management boards are often composed 50% by employers' associations, and 50% of the votes are by labor unions or sick funds. And since they are directly concerned by these reforms, of course, and they have a lot to lose or to win with them, and they push the buttons in the end, they implement, they give their green light or their red light when necessary, it is very difficult to process sometimes because of their majority, in fact their monopoly in these government and management boards. They can slow down, veto, or even overrule sometimes policy initiatives and reforms. In other cases, binding advice from advisory boards like the National Labour Council is needed, and this is true. We have decided between 6 coalition partners on a couple of reforms, pension reforms notably, And some of these projects are stuck in the National Council for Labor because the social partners, employers and labor unions cannot agree on how to implement them. And so the politicians are at the mercy of these, what I call interest groups. They may sometimes indeed serve the common interest, but obviously they have a particular interest to defend as well. And when the common interest doesn't weigh up in their eyes to the particular interests of their members or of their organization that they are defending, well, then they can block these reforms actually in all these councils. And that's a little bit paradoxical to me because the cornerstone of democracy is a constructive transfer of power precisely so as to counter interests of becoming too vested, right? And so in our system, even though the active hand of power changes and is replaced, the same people representing the labor unions, the sick funds, and the employers remain. And of course, I'm not saying these organizations are useless. On the contrary, they have tremendous experience, and we need their advice. We need them to cooperate. I don't believe that you can actually implement reforms without involving these stakeholders and without asking for their expertise. But however, they can only execute. I don't think they should have the right to block, overrule, slow down, or whatnot, all these reforms that come from a political consensus that was very hard to find in Belgium, as you know. Moreover, they don't have to answer to fault. So in the end, the politicians bear the responsibility, but sometimes they are blocked or they have their hands tied because of these organizations not wanting to proceed to a couple of reforms. Voila. And so, again, these organizations, although they're not probably, do not come to your mind as corporations or very aggressive interest groups, they can sometimes indeed block reforms. Or as I would put it, often the status quo offends the fewest. Mr. McCullen yesterday said it differently. Incumbent power is the enemy of innovation and change. And this is what we see in these institutions. They have been there since the establishment, since the development of our modern social security after the Second World War, have always been there. And although their representatives change every 10 years, every 15 years, it's always the same partners in these institutions. And so they have become a part of the establishment. Well, not yet. Let me give you a very concrete example that will show you that these interest groups, although they may have the common interest at heart, do not always, well, the result of some reforms is not always serving the common interest. Last year, we had an agreement within the government to abolish supplementary honorary fees from doctors in hospital in shared rooms. So patients who share a room with other patients, they think, that's what research showed at least, that they will pay the lowest rate, which is what is being reimbursed by Social Security, all right? So their hospital bills should be reasonable, right? However, a couple of hospitals were still practicing supplementary honorary fees in these shared rooms. People were going to these shared rooms thinking they would pay the normal reimbursed price, but in fact, sometimes they were confronted with 400% of supplements because of this particular doctor wanting to ask more. So we decided to find a balance to strike a balance between protecting the patient's financial situation and encouraging the entrepreneurial spirit of our doctors. We said these supplementary honorary fees are only allowed in individual rooms, not anymore in shared rooms. Not easy always for the right-wing parties of our coalition, but we find an agreement. So, of course, the Minister of Health went to see the labor unions of the doctors, talk to the sick funds, etc., because she had to have this legislation agreed by them. They said, we disagree with it. We don't want this. We're not going to ratify your reform. And even if you continue with this, if you insist, we will even go on strike. And of course, having your doctors striking for a Minister of Public Health is a catastrophe. but she needed a formal approval anyway, so both were sort of linked. In the end, after long weeks of negotiating, we found an agreement with the doctors' unions, and the apple was cut in two. It was forbidden for hospitalizations, but it was still allowed for day hospital. And budgetary, that would be pretty much 50-50%. But of course, the patient, and I want to over-dramatize this, but this is in some cases a real problem. Patients going to on a weekly basis for their chemotherapy, for example, to the hospital, would still have to pay these supplementary fees. So I don't think the patient got any better of this, and it was not the intention of the politicians to do so. But we had our hands tied by these, what I would call interest groups, but who have an institutionalized role in our system. It's a very concrete example that I think did enough harm to the patients. So what are a couple of solutions? Because it's one thing to whine about things, it's another one to do something about it. And so I'll give you a couple of very generic sort of pieces of advice. What I always do is I always hit the same nail. I may be the youngest in all these meetings and all these committees. I always bring the same message. The message I will bring you will hear later. Often my messages are welcomed with eyeballing. That is not very pleasant, but that, of course, is a way to intimidate people. These people have been at the highest, in the highest functions of power for a long time, and they know all the tricks to intimidate people and to have you lose your serious or your confidence. And that, of course, is not a good way to proceed. Don't be intimidated by it, and don't show you are intimidated, because that weakens your position. And then one of the messages I always bring is that we have to reform our governance structures. The public governance structures of some Belgian institutions are absurd, and I often compare them to, with all due respect, but to African countries more than Western countries in Europe. Two concrete examples. The Control Committee of the Sick Funds. So it's a social security institution in Belgium who is supposed to control the insurance products and the initiatives of sick funds. The board of the institution for controlling the sick funds is composed by 50% of sick funds themselves. So the sick funds are controlling the sick funds. That is not a good governance structure. Another problem, for example, is with political advisors like myself. We are not submitted to any code whatsoever. I have colleagues who are part-time on the payroll of a hospital lobby group and part-time on the payroll of a political cabinet. Nobody knows about this. I'm not saying we should forbid it. It's definitely something we have to think about, but at least it should be made public. It's not even made public. There's a law for civil servants dated from 1937 who forbids public servants to accept gifts, to go lunch with interest groups, etc., etc., etc. Political advisors don't even fall under that law. There's also a committee. There is a committee who is supposed to supervise the implementation and the respect of all these rules and the deontological code that applies for civil servants. But again, political advisors don't fall under that supervision, which is absurd. I've been invited many times to assist a soccer game or go lunching or whatsoever. I have no rules whatsoever. I don't know when I can accept it, what I can accept, and if I have to make it public or not. No rules whatsoever. Again, you can immediately see there's often a lot of conflict of interest there, and therefore this governance structure is not appropriate any longer in a modern Western European country. And then a fourth piece of advice for day-to-day policy making is to actually change the decision-making processes where necessary. A couple of rules of thumb. I think interest groups have to be involved from the beginning of legislation, but they can only have an advisory role. They can never call the shots themselves. That is, I think, the primacy of politicians. Involve individuals from a certain sector, even if they don't represent an organization as such. Example again, we're going to reform the hospital financing in Belgium. It is very important, I think, to ask the advice of the unions for doctors, but also ask doctors who are maybe not unionized or who don't speak for other people. They may have another view on how this reform should be developed and continued. And then when designing, third rule of thumb, when designing policy, make sure politicians can always overrule stakeholders and interest groups and make sure the primacy of politics is respected. So on a day-to-day basis, we have to monitor that. Second way of, I think, challenge the traditional power structures is from the outside. And I was, as I said, actively involved in two, I think, interesting initiatives. First, within my party, in the something called the M34, which is inspired from the G1000, but on a smaller scale and within the party itself, where 34 people selected based on their age, their socioeconomic profile, their gender, and their interests, were selected as to develop a small part of the vision text that the party will present to its members and which will serve as the basis for the coming elections in May. And I was one of the experts to accompany these non-expert groups in finding concrete policy recommendations. And to my surprise, the input of these people was very valuable and they are more knowledgeable than many people would expect them to be. Second initiative is the Friday Group, which is, as I said, this think tank for young people that I have the honor to preside. And members there are selected on basis of their diversity, which means political diversity. So we try to actively look for people from the left, the right, the center, Christian Democrats, conservatives, progressists, and others, based on their expertise. So there is economists, sociologists, engineers, China experts, people from the art world, entrepreneurs, etc., etc. And then thirdly, also from a very different cultural background. So there's people, as you can see, Belgians from Nigerian origin, from Turkish origin, from Moroccan origins, Belgians from Belgian origin, etc., etc. And so this diversity we try to put together, think about concrete challenges for our generation, and try to find a common solution. And in fact, our second report has been published today. So, one more minute, and then I'm finished. Let's get real. I'm not saying that because we have come with the Friday Group or with the M34 think tanks, we have come to, it's not because everyone agrees on these solutions that makes them more valuable per se, but at least these grassroots initiatives show that it's possible to come to realistic and well-thought solutions by a group of people who, at first glance, have nothing in common and, in fact, have been selected just because of that. So, through this very personal account, I hope I have been able to give a view or to show how traditional power structures can be challenged. Institutions, political parties, political cabinets, but also opinion leaders. Little by little and day after day, it will take a long time before this is completely done, this process is completely done, but it is possible, I believe, and I wish you a very pleasant day. Thank you.